Hello and hello, Bob. We have Bob Dignen from UK joining us tonight. And how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, thank you, Bob. So, Bob, this is our sixth session on virtual teams, and today's topic is planning. So, what are your thoughts on planning projects around a virtual environment? Is it a problem?
Okay, well, yeah. Well, I mean, you would imagine that projects and planning go very well together, and that people involved in projects would normally have a consensus around the meaning and the processes and the practices of planning. My feeling is that planning is actually quite a dilemma now in the field of project management. I think since from the 50s to around 2000, kind of the waterfall concept of planning, a lot of assessments, a lot of data analysis, a lot of structured planning went into projects which was then deployed. And that was good project management. But I think since the early 2000s, with the arrival of complexity and uncertainty in the modern world, there has certainly been a shift away from those traditional definitions of planning to more agile-based approaches. And I think what I see is a lot of disconnect in the attitudes that people bring to the project around planning. Some people believe that structured analysis of risk and elimination of risk and heavy project structures is good project management. Others kind of see that to a degree as Neanderthal, kind of prehistoric, and that the world now should be shorter iterative cycles, rapid planning, hit the target, let the team decide the plan and execute in a self-directed way. And I think planning is to a degree a little bit in crisis. Nobody really knows or has a hold on the truth about planning, the best way to plan. So I think it's an interesting moment for project management. What is planning?
So just basically addressing what you mentioned, Bob. From my understanding is that there is no standard of what planning should be today, because there was a standard of the waterfall cycle and everyone followed that, but now some people talk agile, some talk waterfall, some talk they've got their own I guess in-house planning methods that are non-standard. So now there's no common language for planning. Is that the main challenge today? Apart from the complexity.
I think the primary issue is now, does planning help a project execute? And if you're operating in an environment which is highly fluid, highly uncertain, if you're working virtually and you don't really understand the data that people are going to bring to the project until you've started the project, it really brings into question how much planning you should do. And I think particularly those leading international projects are really struggling with which degree of planning is necessary and which degree of planning becomes a handicap. Because if you set the frame, if you plan too heavily and you set the wrong frame, which is signed off within your organization, to unpick that frame to a new reality becomes very difficult indeed. There's no simple answer to this, but I just see project managers struggling to define planning in the right way.
And so what could be a solution to this dilemma? Is there a way to get, for instance, let's say international teams and virtual teams to come up with a strategy or a good way to plan their virtual projects?
Well, in an ideal world, you would probably say for a team to adapt their planning to the needs of the situation. So, if you have to release a relatively known and familiar software, you can probably plan how to do that. You know your environment. Whereas if you're working in a more uncertain context, you might need to adapt in a more agile way. The problem is that companies generally have project management methodologies which insist that project managers plan in a certain way. So those working in these large strategic international projects often have their hands tied. They have to plan in a certain way, to release the budgets in a certain way. They have to report in a certain way. And I see that's causing a disconnect, that the planning logic is driven by an internal company logic, not by the environment of the project. And there's very little you can do actually to resolve that dilemma other than share it within the team, realize that it's a paradox of your environment, and not allow the systemic difficulties to start to become corrupt, start to corrupt the team, if you know what I mean.
And are there kind of simple tools that can be used for any project, or I mean, you know, there are certain tools like Wunderlist, which is a very basic, I guess, task scheduling, and you know, you can assign tasks to teams, and you know, to tick them off and things like that. I mean, it doesn't incorporate a Gantt chart or anything complex, but it kind of it could be a simple tool that anyone can or virtual teams can use to make sure they're on track and everything. Or do you suggest anything else that simple tools that virtual team members can adapt?
I mean, those kinds of collaboration tools are certainly useful for virtual teams. They give a common environment within which data can be shared, and decisions can therefore be taken. But I think the problem goes a little bit more, goes a bit deeper. I think one of the major problems of virtual teams are international. Generally, they are composed of individuals in different countries. And when you're in different countries, when you try to plan, what you need to do is collect data. What you do is you go to your local IT system and you try to collect data from that local IT system. The problem is, in the large global corporates, the IT systems in the different countries don't quite, they're not the same. So they don't have the same data, they don't have the same data quality, they don't have the same data detail. And I think that's very, very difficult for those in the large international projects, that when they want to collect data to plan, they really struggle to collect data with the same meaning to the same level. So one of the problems is data quality for those leading virtual projects, and they're very often working with very uneven levels of data, which can mean that the plans that you put in place are perhaps not the correct plans, and so a degree of adjustment is necessary.
Sure. And so what are there specific guidelines that team members can take to be able to make better sense of data and be able to, I guess, work in a more effective and efficient manner?
Well, I think it's very important when you're collecting data within the planning cycle in a project to make very clear what that data means. I mean, I've seen HR projects, for example, they've been tasked to collect the number of learning hours across the globe, because they want to improve the provision of learning globally. So they want to know basically how many hours of learning are happening as a basic starting point for analysis. But of course, an hour of learning means different things in different places, paradoxically. An hour of learning in Germany means 45 minutes. That's an hour. Eine Stunde is 45 minutes. In the UK, it's 60 minutes. So some of the basic concepts by which data is constructed may be very, very different. And I think those leading virtual teams just need to pay a little bit of attention to the meaning of data and the assumptions behind the data. Mm-hmm. So it just means, I think, just taking a little bit of time just to investigate the historical logic, why that data was constructed in that way, the meaning of that data, and actually the quality of the data, because whatever data you extract from your IT system may not be accurate. And that's another phenomenon that I see that not many people talk about it, but many of the big companies are deeply concerned that the data quality that they have is very poor. They don't actually know their own business. I mean, I've seen international projects where you're asked to collect a certain number, for example, the investment in learning and development. They can't collect the number because it's not actually stored anywhere in any of the systems. So not only is the data at different levels, sometimes the data isn't there. And I think virtual teams, before they proceed too quickly into the planning cycle, they just need to recognize that planning and data collection is actually a little bit more complex, which you don't often see if you're just doing it from your domestic context, because it's kind of clear. But you go internationally, you can get some very nasty surprises about the different levels and meanings of data. So just taking time to investigate that with maybe a data meeting, for example, could save a lot of heartache.
Absolutely, and I think it goes back also to how we make assumptions about what we think or interpret the data the way we, from our perspective and our point of view. Whether so there obviously there may be cultural elements to it. There may be organizational. It could be personal. But I think what you really are pointing out here is that the communication element is really important, and getting people together and clarifying that that the data that they're saying is this, kind of inquiring about whether this is what it actually means, or whether it's different to what the interpretation may be. So it's more about the communication element and clarification before planning takes place.
Yeah, and then you have kind of cultural and psychological attitudes with respect to the quality of the data. I mean, there are kind of some cultural contexts where there's a really high demand for high quality data in order to eliminate risk. It's a risk intolerant environment. Mm-hmm. Other people are a little bit more relaxed with data quality because they tolerate greater risk. They just want to get the project moving and get some kind of result. So that kind of analytical attitude to data against the more action-oriented attitude to data, I see causing issues in projects. People bring different attitudes. Some want to analyze and some want to just act. And you also have the problem in virtual teams, as you collect the data, who then takes decisions what to do with it? With virtual teams, very often the data is collected by a central team, a core team, and then they collect the data and they make decisions based on that data. And that produces a level of hierarchy and centralization that can be very frustrating for those who are then recipients of the plan when to which they have not actually contributed. So, virtual teams, because if you're in Australia and I'm sitting with my core team in the UK, I probably don't necessarily involve you in the management of the data and the planning around that data. And I think that produces kind of disconnect. So I think it's very important. You've got the issue of data quality. You've got the issue of do we want to act rather than analyze? And then there is the power around who makes the decision with the data collected. And unless there are discussions around that, it's very easy for feelings of exclusion to occur, which can over time lead to disengagement with the project.
Absolutely. And I think there's quite a few different elements there in terms of the hierarchical element of who's making the decision on the data. And it kind of, as you were talking about that, it reminded me of the BP oil spill issue, where there was data. It was provided to people on the ground, but it was just not taken seriously because the quality assurance team was quite distant from those who were actually making decisions on the ground. So that could be an element of it. Is the structure of the organization and the hierarchy, but also what you mentioned about the uncertainty avoidance of different cultures working together, where those who have high uncertainty avoidance require more data, and those who have low uncertainty avoidance would just take action and not worry about it. And there's this conflict between the different. Yeah. I guess it is a very complex issue, and there's probably no real simple answer to it other than influencing communication and trying to get everyone on the same page and to form some form of consensus as what is important and what is not, and how to proceed, which is
It comes back to what you were saying, I think, around assumptions. I mean, this is a constant theme through many of our conversations. And I think it's about surfacing the assumptions that you have behind your data and the attitudes to that data, in order that you kind of have a common way of working going forward, and understanding, for example, that one component of the data relating to safety, for example, may have a much higher priority than other forms of data. I've seen major projects have, because they're not confident of the data around safety, for example, in an aluminium environment where you're producing smelting aluminium, a lot of electricity is moving around, and if the data isn't secure as to where that electricity is, then the project gets stopped, because safety in some industries is absolutely the first priority. So human safety data may have greater priority over other forms of data, and that can cause a lot of frustrations to different hierarchies of data itself.
Absolutely. So would it be worth for everyone to kind of talk about what is acceptable, what is not acceptable? So being more specific about the outcomes, and I guess looking at risks in particular, and kind of identifying those risks, and kind of talking about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and coming up with a consensus in an environment where everyone generally has a different approach to things and has a, I guess, different understanding of requirements.
Well, what I see, I think, with a lot of these larger, complex virtual projects is that there's a kind of pressure early in the project to get moving, to deliver. You have the kickoff meeting. Very often, that kickoff meeting, early planning structures are put in place. Then people go back to their countries. They start then flooding the PMO with data. It's not actually clear what the status of that data is, but there's a kind of a pressure to report progress in the project, so that kind of gets ignored. And then 6 months into the project, you suddenly realize actually what we're doing isn't really valid, because we don't actually understand some of the data we're working with. So I think just for those leading these larger virtual projects, just to put in place kind of realistic planning cycles, not to go too quickly. It's perhaps the old kind of Japanese philosophy of taking time at the beginning in order to gain traction later on.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important element you mentioned about data and what it actually means. And I think perhaps a lot of times it's not clarified as what data really, data providing to the PMO actually is useful. So clarifying that up front, and maybe even in a pictorial format, having systems diagrams and talking about risks and what it means and consequences, and so all of this up front would probably be quite useful down the track.
On the flip side, we're talking very pragmatically and rationally about making sure that data is clear. I mean, another component of working with larger projects is, of course, managing the data. And if you have difficult data to report to senior management, sometimes that data is suppressed. It's held back. You release only data which allows the project to continue. If you release the wrong data, which sends the wrong messages, you open yourself to criticism as the project leader. You open yourself to project auditing by external financial experts. So that is another dilemma for those leading large, politically very important projects, that they come up against the problem: should I be honest with the data, or do I need to manage the data? And that's often a very ethical challenge for those who perhaps have never faced that kind of challenge before.
Absolutely. So then it is the issue of transparency and how that is managed. as you mentioned, there is a I guess ethical element to it, and there's probably a consequence either way. Withholding and releasing the data would have certain consequences, whether you hold it or release it. So it's, I guess it is a quite a complex issue, and a lot of things need to be considered, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, be aware that which data, when you're a project leader and you're reporting the data into the steering committee, that generally the only data they want is the financials and that we're on track. And if project leads are often technical experts, they often deliver too much granular information to senior management, which frustrates senior management, and they often raise too many problems with the data to senior management. Senior management often wants simplicity. They want it black and white. They don't want any problems, and they just want the message the project is on track, hitting the strategic milestones. And for those leaders of large international projects, if they start to challenge that communication culture with respect to data, they can very quickly run into frustrations from the sponsor, which can be very, very serious to their own career, to their own reputation.
And one final question, Bob. Do you think there are some certain granular data that is generally important that needs to be communicated to senior management, but is withheld by project managers? Is there certain data that might be useful, even though it might be irritating, but it's actually important, that you think that it needs to be kind of considered?
You mean, is there any data that should be surfaced, you mean?
Absolutely. So you mentioned, generally the senior management want things to be on track, and they want the financial data, and they don't want to see the problems, but and that's generally what they get. But is there particular important data that usually needs to be communicated, and that would result in a more positive outcome or a high chance of project success?
I mean, I think it's again, you're asking one of these absolute questions.
Yeah, which it doesn't exist.
Through our conversations, I'll always kick back and say this is always going to depend, but it's a good question to ask. And you're constantly facing the dilemma when you're leading these large, complex projects. How transparent should I be? What level of data should I really report? If I report the wrong data, does my project get put on hold? If I withhold the data and get the go-ahead for the project, does that compromise me ethically? So data is not a simple phenomenon when you start leading complex projects. And I think just being aware that facts are no longer just facts. They are part of a political exchange of sensitive information, which has implications for you, your reputation. It has implications for the flow of the project, and it has implications even for the success of the project. So data becomes a much more complex phenomenon, maybe, than it has been in previous times for those leading virtual projects. And just being aware of that, I think, can be useful. Things are a little bit more complicated than in the past.
Absolutely. And I think just one final point, it also raises the challenge of knowing who to share the data with, because when we have many different stakeholders, you sometimes wonder, does that person actually need to know about this data? Or it could simply be an email that you're sending to a number of stakeholders, and you might have a dilemma of who you're going to include and who you're going to copy in. So that tends to be a challenge in a lot of ways, and sometimes you might think, maybe I'll be bothering that person and flooding their inbox with information that they might need, or it could be that they actually need that information further down the track, or they might be they might feel that they should have been included. So it's one of those unique challenges which there is no a real simple answer to.
Yeah, and what you're touching upon there, I think, is often underestimated by those leading kind of cross-border projects. It's what you're describing there is project marketing. And it's curious, even working with global marketing teams, when you sit and do a team build with them, they often diagnose that they undermarket their own projects. And it's not just about giving out data about the project, it's about giving good news messages into the organization about the project, which is not kind of managing the truth, it's just building user engagement with the project so that the users want to be part of the success of the project and take the project results. And that, again, that kind of slight manipulation of data, that telling stories, is a competence which doesn't come necessarily easily to IT, to finance, to legal specialists. And the ability to sell using data is a much underestimated competence in project management today.
Absolutely, and something we can potentially explore in our next session, Bob.
That sounds a very good idea.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thanks again. And so today we basically covered some important aspects of data, transparency, risk planning, and we'll further explore more topics in our next session. So thanks again for joining, and I look forward to see you in the next session, Bob.
Yeah, look forward to seeing you too. Take care.
And have a good night. Bye-bye.